the right button. There we go. All right. Welcome to the podcast. This is episode 4 about the Christiana Riot. So episode 1, just a little summary to where we're at this point. Episode 1, we covered the escape from Retreat Farm down in northern Maryland when Noah Burley, John and George Hammond, and Nelson Ford escaped from Gorsuch, the farmer who the slaver who kept them in bondage. Episode 2, we did some background, talking about the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and how, what George Washington did to cover his tracks because it was such an unpopular act. Episode 3, we talked about William Parker, the abolitionist, who was going to be instrumental in the coming riot. And so for episode 4, we're going to do a little bit more background, and then we're going to be getting into the actual riot and trial and all that stuff after this. So this is, kind of just summary of where we were in the last background episode. The Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution basically said that fugitive slaves had to be returned to their home states. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was the act that made a law around that clause, because with the Constitution you have to put it into action.
Yeah.
And from basically from the beginning there was attempts to strengthen that Fugitive Slave Act. In 1801 there was a response, in 1801 there was a push to for a federal anti-kidnapping law, which never passed. Oh wait, what? I'm messing myself up here. In 1801, there was a attempt to pass a federal anti-kidnapping law, a law that basically said that you couldn't go into a free state, capture a slave, and drag them back to a slave state. That made the South freak out.
Right.
They didn't like the idea of a federal law saying that they couldn't kidnap people
right.
and bring them into slavery. So they started talking about a need to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. There was another attempt in 1817 to make an anti-kidnapping law. And
they always have a problem with very reasonable laws.
Yeah.
They also threw up, they really didn't want a law to prevent extrajudicial executions.
Yeah. So in 1817, what the South decided to do in response to these proposed anti-kidnapping laws was to propose their own law to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act by requiring Northern judges to sign certificates based on Southern judges' orders. One prominent historian said that the proposal would make Northern governors and judicial officers virtually the ministerial agents of Southern state officials. So they wanted a law that basically said that Southern judges could say, a Southern judge could make a decision that someone was a fugitive slave and could be brought back to their state, and the Northern judges could do nothing about it. That was their proposal. It was let's just make the Southern judges more important than the Northern judges. And that didn't pass for obvious reasons. The Northern judges didn't like that.
The Southern judges are just totally in charge of whether or not someone is a slave.
Yeah. So that attempt in 1817 to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act didn't go anywhere. They were going to keep trying up until 1850 when we get the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But before we get there, one of the main reasons that they were concerned about strengthening the fugitive slave law, was the growth of something called personal liberty laws and abolitionism in general. So personal liberty laws were laws in northern free states that were enacted between 1780 and 1859 that protected African Americans from kidnapping and from being claimed as fugitive slaves. Slaveholding states complained that these laws violated the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and the Slave Act of 1793. Abolitionists responded that a fundamental principle of state sovereignty was that states could define the status of its inhabitants and protect their liberty. Hey, this, a fundamental concept of states' rights is that we get to say whether the people in our states are free or not.
Yeah. Whether or not the people from another state are allowed to take away the people from our state.
Yes. They thought that, that was the argument of abolitionists. Very reasonable. And ultimately, when the Civil War came in 1860, 1861, slave states would cite personal liberty laws as evidence of the failure of northern states to uphold their end of the constitutional bargain. In 1780, Pennsylvania passed its Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, which provided that every slave born after the passage of that act would be freed after their 28th birthday. In doing so, the state faced the possibility of slaveholders just selling their slaves out of state rather than allowing them to become free when they turned 28. So to combat this, Pennsylvania required slaveholders to register their slaves and forbid the sale or transportation out of state, which created incentives for abolitionist societies to monitor unscrupulous slavers. Pennsylvania had basically created a new kind of criminal kidnapping and passed a personal liberty law designed to protect, this class of people that gradual abolition would eventually create. Pennsylvania went further in 1820 with a law that defined kidnapping as removing any person from Pennsylvania with a design or intention of selling and or disposing of or causing to be sold a slave or servant for a year or years. So they basically said you can't sell anybody into slavery is the law that they passed. The penalty for this was a fine between $500 and $2,000 and 7 to 21 years of hard labor.
That's quite a penalty.
Yeah, they were taking it seriously. So
I mean, it should be like pretty illegal to kidnap someone and make them a slave.
Yeah. So 1820, Pennsylvania's taking it seriously. They said no selling anybody into slavery. And one of the interesting things was the way that they worded it is, depending on the interpretation of the judge, there was really no distinction between someone who removed a fugitive slave and someone who kidnapped a free person.
Okay.
Both could be theoretically prosecuted under the law. So it basically made it impossible to enforce any Fugitive Slave Act in Pennsylvania.
Okay, so it wasn't just, was it intended that way?
I think it was intended to be vague.
Okay.
So that they could let individual cases be,
Because I was wondering if it was intended to protect fugitive slaves that had escaped, or if it was just intended to protect, free black people who were already citizens of the state.
It was on its face just intended to protect free black citizens from kidnapping.
But the wording was vague enough.
It was left vague enough that there was any slaver attempting to capture a fugitive slave in Pennsylvania.
They were going to run into some trouble.
There was a chance, depending on the judge that they drew for their case, there was a chance they could face 7 to 20 years of hard labor.
Okay. Which is, it'll disincentivize some people from trying to recapture freed slaves. Yeah.
So Maryland did not like this, being the state immediately to the south of Pennsylvania that liked their slaves. So they lobbied Pennsylvania to repeal its Anti-Kidnapping Act and pass laws that were more favorable to their interests. Maryland also lobbied other border states like New Jersey and Delaware for a law that would not only compel state judges to participate in fugitive slave rendition, but also create the presumption of slavery for any person of color.
Oh, well, that's quite a step.
Yeah, so that was Maryland's response to that, was to ask
presumption of slavery.
The presumption of slavery.
Jesus.
Yeah, any black person, just presume they're a slave, and then if somebody kidnaps them to sell them into slavery,
they have to prove they're not a slave.
They have to prove, they put the burden of proof on the person facing slavery.
I don't know how I would prove that I'm not a slave.
No, it's insane. They wanted that to be the new legal standard. Shifting the burden of proof from the slaveholder to the alleged fugitive. And, like I said, give them the burden of proving that they were a free person. Delaware passed a version of that statute.
Did they?
Yeah, so that actually worked in Delaware. Pennsylvania and New Jersey told them no, and actually passed like slightly stronger anti-kidnapping laws in response. They're like, no, fuck you. We're going to do the opposite. Delaware tried to kind of take like a weird middle route where they simultaneously strengthened their anti-kidnapping law while also passing a law that put the burden of proof on black people to prove they're not slaves.
Oh, okay. So like it was, you had to prove that you weren't a slave.
Yeah.
But if you could prove you weren't a slave, the person kidnapping you got in a lot of trouble.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And out of those three states, I guess at the time,
I can see being able to sell that to people.
Yeah. And I think at the time, Jersey was still a slave state to some degree, and Delaware definitely was.
Yeah.
So I don't know that that probably factored into their.
Yeah. I can see selling that to people who have no real stake in it. It's like like voter ID laws.
Yeah.
Like the same kind of like argument.
Yeah.
You're like, well, if they're not doing anything wrong, then it shouldn't be a problem for them.
Right. So these laws kind of emboldened abolitionist societies, and so they kept pushing, and they eventually were able to get more state personal liberty laws passed that defined kidnapping as removing any person from the state. In some cases, they forbid the issuance of certificates of removal by state officers. So in some northern states, they effectively made fugitive slave rendition impossible. So these personal liberty laws were quite effective in a lot of northern states, which just pissed off southern states more and more, and led to them to continue to push for, a strengthening of the Fugitive Slave Act. States' rights to protect the residents from kidnapping and slaveholders' property rights collided in the case of Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which came before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1842. And this is kind of a important stepping stone legally towards the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So Edward Prigg was a Maryland slave catcher who crossed into Pennsylvania to seize a woman named Margaret Morgan. Morgan was born to parents who were both technically slaves, but their owner, John Ashmore, had allowed Margaret's parents to live in freedom in Maryland and made no claim of ownership over them. So they were like,
they were like slaves on paper.
They were slaves on paper, but John Ashmore didn't do anything. He just let them live their lives. And so Margaret was born into this system. So since she was born from a mom who was a slave,
she was technically
a slave, but she was raised as a free person and never had any real reason to think of herself as a slave. It never factored into her life really. But she was technically a slave. So Margaret Morgan married a free black man from Pennsylvania named Jerry Morgan, and moved up to Pennsylvania with him after her parents died in 1832. And presumably she had the consent of Ashmore's widow. John Ashmore is dead at the time, and there's reason to think that the widow knew that she was moving to Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
They were essentially neighbors.
Yeah, she wasn't fleeing.
Yeah, it was basically her neighbor moved out to Pennsylvania to go live with her new husband. There, no reason to think that she snuck away or anything like that. So for 5 years, she lived in Pennsylvania. She had some kids. She was just living a normal life. And in 1837, Ashmore's son-in-law, this guy named Nathan Bemis, decided to claim Margaret and her children. So I guess at this point, John's widow had died, and his son-in-law, Nathan Bemis, had inherited the slaves, and he wanted them.
And he was like, this is just money on the table. Nobody's doing anything about this.
Right. So
I'm an asshole.
Yes. So he took 3 of his neighbors with him. One was this guy, Edward Prigg, and they went up to Pennsylvania to capture Margaret and her children. Edward Prigg kind of, I guess, was a semi-professional slave catcher. So he led the expedition, and he seized Margaret and her 3 children under a warrant that was technically obtained under the Pennsylvania personal liberty law. So he went through the legal channels within, what the Pennsylvania laws were at the time. And she was technically a slave. So he was able to get his certificate, and he went and captured her. But under the Pennsylvania personal liberty laws at the time, it still had to be reviewed by a Pennsylvania justice of the peace. So they had a little hearing, and the whole story was told about how she never really lived as a slave, and her kids had never lived as a slave. And the judge basically decided that they shouldn't be taken away, that they should be left in Pennsylvania. So Bemis and Prigg, and they didn't like that ruling, and so they decided to just ignore it.
They both have very...
Bemis and Prigg.
Yeah, they have terrible names.
It's really, really bad names. So they decided to ignore it and to take them away anyway. So they had not technically secured a certificate of removal. They I guess there was a certificate to capture them, but there was
a separate certificate to take them out of the state.
Yeah. And so a Pennsylvania grand jury indicted Prigg for kidnapping under the personal liberty laws. And Prigg appealed it to the Supreme Court. The court held that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was, precluded the Pennsylvania state law, and the court overturned the conviction of Prigg. The Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story was the guy who wrote the majority of opinion at the time. He said that if one part of the country may disregard one part of the Constitution, another selection may be refused to obey that part which seems to bear here upon its interests, and thus the Union will be a mere rope of sand, and the Constitution worse than a dead letter, an apple of discord in our midst, and a fruitful source of reproach, bitterness, and hatred, and in the end, discord and civil war. So Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story basically saying that if we can't have every state follow the Constitution the same, then civil war is inevitable. So overturn Prigg's conviction. Because
he was right about the the Civil War was going to happen.
Only one judge dissented, and they all basically agreed that the U.S. Constitution guaranteed the right of a Maryland citizen to go into Pennsylvania and capture their property. In Story's argument, this provided for uniformity in the law throughout the nation that would not be diluted by conflicting state laws. Despite differing opinions on Story's ruling, Prigg led to many northern states removing any enforcement mechanisms in helping Southerners reclaim escaped slaves. So the northern states kind of rebelled against this ruling. It was unpopular, and so they pushed for basically they pushed for laws saying that we're not going to help you reclaim your slaves in any way.
Right.
They're like, fine, if this is the rule, there's nothing we can do about it.
You have to do it.
Yeah, we're not going to do anything to help you. So Southerners continued to push for what became the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and cited personal liberty laws as a grievance against the northern states. As I said, the other primary reason for pushing for the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was this growing tension between slavers and abolitionists. The abolition movement had, by the mid-1800s, had grown to a fairly large political force within America. Going back to 1688, in Pennsylvania, the Germantown Quakers wrote a petition against slavery. They were the first. That was the first religious petition against African slavery in what would become the United States.
I think I vaguely remember that. I said something about that, I think, in the first episode. Yeah. I couldn't remember the specifics.
Yeah, 1688 in Germantown. So that's the first time any religious group in the U.S. said slavery was fucked up. By 1775, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society had formed in Philadelphia. That was the first abolition society within what would very shortly after that become the United States of America. In 1777, Vermont, which at the time had declared themselves the independent Vermont Republic, partly banned slavery, freeing men over the age of 21 and women over the age of 18. But they didn't really enforce it. It was a symbolic slavery banning.
Okay.
They said that slavery over those ages was banned, but they didn't do anything to take slaves away from people.
They just said, don't do that.
Yeah. And then, like I said, in 1780, Pennsylvania passed their act for gradual abolition of slavery. Those born prior to the act would remain enslaved for life. And afterwards, like I said, freed at the age of 28. So that became kind of the model for abolition in northern states. The 1780 Pennsylvania rule. They're like, okay, if you were born into it, we're going to keep you forever, but we'll figure out an age to free you if you were born after the passage of the act. That's what most northern states ended up doing. Because of this, the last slaves in Pennsylvania were freed in 1847.
Okay.
So 1780 to pass this gradual abolition act, in 1847 to actually have the last slaves freed.
Those people were slaves for a long time.
Took a long time. And that's the thing is I've reading about this time period and this stuff. It was public sentiment in Pennsylvania was largely against slavery, and I think a little bit later in this episode, we'll talk a little bit about what it was like in Pennsylvania, to be a freeman or to be a slave. But it was never like a huge economic engine in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. It was always like more for show, or a show of wealth than anything else. So when they passed the Gradual Abolition Act in 1780, like a lot of people just freed their slaves. They're like, okay, this is coming to an end. Like, we don't need to house them and feed them and clothe them anymore. Like, let's just let it go. But so these people that held them until 1847, like, they're just bastards.
Yeah, they were committed.
Yeah, they're like, no, I don't care.
They're committed to the institution of slavery.
Like, I am going to hold these people as long as I possibly can. So 1783, Massachusetts Supreme Court rules that slavery is unconstitutional. Based on the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, all slaves were immediately freed. So we're getting more aggressive there. 1776. I jumped back a little bit. I should have put that a little earlier in my timeline. But in 1776, shortly after the Pennsylvania Abolition Society had formed in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Yearly Quaker Meeting officially declared that you could not be a member of the meeting if you owned slaves. So the Quakers were leading the way on this. 1797, that's why I put it down in the timeline further. Okay, I'm confusing myself. 1797, the Philadelphia meeting actually put rules into place to discipline members if they hadn't freed their slaves.
Okay.
They're like, hey, like, we said this like 20 years ago. We're fucking serious. Like, you can't be a member if you don't free your slaves. And they also added to that one that you still owed them some charity after you freed them. They're like, you can't just like hold these people in bondage their whole lives and then just throw them out on the street either. You have to like provide for them.
You gotta get them set up. Yeah.
Yeah. In 1806, the Philadelphia meeting pointed out that you can't hire slaves. That I guess, like, this is the whole thing. This played out over like 40 years. Yeah. They're like, first they're like, you can't be a Quaker if you own slaves. And they're like, no, seriously, we mean it. They're like, and you also can't just throw them out on the street. And then again, 1806, they're like, and you can't hire somebody else's slaves. That's not any better. It really took a long time for these people to like understand.
Like, there can't just be one dude that has all the slaves who's like taking the hit.
Yeah.
And you're all just hiring that dude's slaves.
John Chandler, a British Quaker, commented on Philadelphia after visiting, "The members of our religious society form a numerous body in the city, and many of them are wealthy and have prominent influence. But the general prejudice of the community on this head is too deeply rooted for them individually or unitedly to overcome. In fact, they make no effort to overcome it. They are kind to colored people. They are their necessities. They visit their sick, educate their orphan children, and perform to them many disinterested acts of love and mercy. But still they seem to consider them aliens, as people who have no right to a possession in the land that gave them birth." So, yeah, Quakers were freeing them, and they were doing like whatever they had to do to help them out, but they weren't gonna like let them join the meeting or anything like that. They still weren't viewing them as equals. 1790, Baltimore Quakers said that no one could own a slave and be a Quaker in Maryland. Still not as opposed to slavery as Quakers in other states would be, but this is like, if you remember in the first episode, Ed Gorsuch had Quaker ancestry and had Quaker neighbors and interacted with the Quaker community a good bit. I think a big part of the reason that the Gorsuch family and other slavers in Maryland kind of moved away from Quakerism is that 1790 declaration that they couldn't be Quakers and own slaves. So, there was this like weird mix in northern Maryland where there was a lot of Quakers, and it's right over the border from Pennsylvania. There's a lot of Quakers there, but they really like their slavery.
It's interesting that they didn't just start their own Quaker church.
Yeah.
Because, like, I don't know, that's how religious schisms happen a lot of the time. Like, that's where the Southern Baptist Church came from.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think it's the largest Protestant denomination in the country.
Is it really?
I think so.
Oh wow! I have no idea what the largest.
But that's when they split off from like the mainline Baptist was, like the church like declared that. I think it was you couldn't be like a clergyman and own slaves.
Okay, so they started their own.
So they were like,
church.
yes, you can. And yeah, they started their own. Yeah.
I think, well, at least in Gorsuch's case, I think his family just became Methodist. I don't know. I guess they figured it was close enough.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Quakers are less hard line about that stuff too. So maybe if you have that like Quaker mentality, you don't feel like the need to schism.
Yeah.
You're just like, whatever. I just won't be a Quaker anymore then.
Well, that's what I want, because like Baptists don't really have a doctrine either. They kind of have like, it's a much more like, I mean, compared to the Quakers, they're a little bit doctrinal, but
yeah,
compared to like the Catholics and the the Calvinists and stuff, like they're like, they were much more like every church was kind of its own thing.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that the Quakers didn't end up doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, there wasn't some kind of slavery owning Quaker.
Yeah.
That would be so weird. I mean, just living in southern Pennsylvania and knowing a lot of Quakers, like, it would be weird if there was like a Southern Baptist version of the Quakers. I can't wrap my head around what that would be.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem weird.
Yeah, that would be a very strange...
Because they were like, I mean, there used to be like, the Quakers had like a little bit of a reputation for like stuffiness. Like, like not drinking and like, partying and like stuff like that. But like, they've always been like pretty progressive on like social issues and stuff like that. It would be weird if there was like a hardline conservative like Quaker church.
I mean, I guess it could work. Like the inherent, like, I've been to Quaker services and you just sit there quietly.
You don't have to do anything.
Yeah. So it would just be like the same like Quaker meeting.
It was just people sitting there quietly thinking about how much they like slavery.
Or they just like in the modern version, like the modern descendant of the Southern Baptist Quakers would be like the same type of Quaker meeting. They just wouldn't put like their like anti-war signs out like on next to the road in front of their meeting house.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't have like the...
They were like, we're just going to go to a nice stone building every week and we're going to sit there quietly and think about how trans people make us uncomfortable.
Yeah. We're not gonna put any signs up by the road that tell people that they shouldn't commit violence.
Yeah.
So some Baltimore Quakers thought that distributing abolitionist literature was a mistake because they thought it would lessen their influence over their neighbors. That was what we saw with Gorsuch's Miller neighbor who turned in the slaves. He thought that he needed to be, I don't know, shitty to enslaved people so that he would have some future influence to help enslaved people. Yeah. That was just kind of the general idea of the Baltimore Quakers at the time. They're like, we don't want to like be too abolitionist. We don't want to be out there like handing out abolitionist pamphlets or anything, because then they won't listen to anything we say. Which, I mean, I understand the logic behind it. There might be something there. But it still feels like it's like a weird like half measure, like, they're not really following through on their supposed convictions.
And it's like a risky, it's like, what's that? It was like a Kurt Vonnegut story where like the guy was like, I don't know, like pretending to be a Nazi, but like secretly working for the Allies. But like, I don't know, he had to do all kinds of like war crime shit.
I don't know if I read that one.
Yeah. And it was like, I don't know, it was kind of like him at like the end of his life reflecting about like whether or not he was like any better than like, the lower level Nazis that did the same bad shit.
Yeah.
But like he didn't really mean it. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
That's always an interesting thing. I always wonder about like how many crimes undercover agents commit and things like that.
And that was kind of like the moral of that story. It was like, if you pretend to be something hard enough, that's just what you are.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't matter. So over time, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, who kind of kicked off this whole abolitionist thing, began to view abolitionists as radicals and tried to distance themselves from the abolition movement. But at this point, the abolition movement, abolition societies had grown beyond the Quakers. This was like a whole, essentially a political party in a lot of ways. It was actually a lot of different political parties, but it was a political movement. Mm-hmm. Its birth was in the Philadelphia Quaker community, but it at this point had grown national. So there, in August 21st and 22nd, 1850, so right around the time that the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, there was actually a fugitive slave convention in Casanova, New York. So fugitive slaves and abolition had grown to the point that they were now having like meetings and conventions, and this was a big factor in the lead up to the Civil War. This one in 1850, the reason I kind of jumped ahead in the timeline to talk about this one was because it was the biggest one ever held in the United States. Okay. It had a high turnout relative to the size of the community in Casanova. It was one of those things where, like, you know, it became like the second biggest city in New York for like the 2 days of the convention, one of those types of things. It was also kind of an interesting thing because they took a daguerreotype of the attendees. Huh. And so a lot of like prominent abolitionists of the time period are in this photograph. Like I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's this famous photograph. I think it's called like A Day in Harlem, that is like all like of the jazz greats of like the 1940s and 1950s all like were together in Harlem, New York, and posed for a picture on like the steps of this building. And you can look through and be like, oh, there's Duke Ellington, there's Miles Davis.
Yeah, there's another one. It's like there was like it was some physics conference in like the 1920s, and it's like anybody that was like, you know, had like a big influence on like, you know, the development of quantum physics.
Yeah, it's like Niels Bohr and
is like in that picture.
Yeah, I've seen that picture too. So this was one of those, but for the fugitive slave movement, for the abolition movement. It was taken at this fugitive slave convention in Casanova. It was organized by this man Gerrit Smith, who was the president of the New York State Vigilance Committee. Gerrit Smith was a cool guy. He lived 1797 to 1874. He was America's foremost philanthropist and reformer when it came to the abolition movement. He was a major participant in the Underground Railroad and later became a significant figure in the early parts of the women's suffrage movement. He was a rich kid, grew up, you know, wealthy and took on liberal causes like some rich people do. His father was a man named Peter Smith, who made a fortune in the fur trade as a partner to John Jacob Astor. So this is, you know, basically Astor's business partner's kid, Gerrit Smith.
The Astors came up in one of our bonus episodes.
The Astors come up. They were around. Peter Smith, Gerrit's father, established the village of Petersburg, New York in 1795 and named it after himself, which is always a weird move.
That's what I would do. If I founded a city, I would call it Andyland.
Yeah. I was just listening to a thing the other day about like early American exploration, and they talked about how Champlain named the lake after himself.
Yeah.
I don't think I would name something after myself like that. I feel like it's weird.
I mean, I think Andyland is fun, and it sounds like Candyland.
That is a fun name. Yeah, but I don't know. So yeah, he named the town.
Your last name is problematic though. Because it's just a cardinal direction.
Yeah, west is not easy for
like people would be like, what, like the West Town, like it's, you know, there's probably a lot of those.
Yeah, and it's funny this is a total aside, but growing up with that name, like I've always wondered, like maybe there's one.
Yeah.
Like maybe there is one like West Town, West Grove, like maybe there is one town named West something that is not named after the direction. And like you would never know. You would always just assume. But maybe there's one somewhere in the world.
Yeah, your name's a problem for that. Yeah.
I've always wondered. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the prominent women's rights activist, was Gerrit Smith's cousin. The important family. In 1840, Smith helped organize the Liberty Party, which was the first openly abolitionist political party, the first like single issue abolitionist party, the Liberty Party. Which, if there's a Liberty Party now, it's probably pretty conservative, I would imagine.
Yeah, I bet there's a Liberty Party.
Yeah, I bet they're not cool.
I bet they're weird.
Yeah. So February 1842, he hosted the New York State Liberty Party convention at his mansion in Petersboro. Several Liberty Party candidates went on to win election in local offices, but they weren't able to have any success at the state or federal level. Overall, Smith would be nominated for president of the United States 4 times by various political parties and nominated for the governor of New York once. He didn't win any of those, but you know,
it's an honor just to be nominated.
Popular guy to nominate as a fringe candidate. He befriended Frederick Douglass when Douglass moved to Rochester in 1847 and influenced Douglass to move beyond the views of William Lloyd Garrisonian abolition, and embrace a more radical, more immediate form of abolitionism. You know, Garrisonian abolitionism, in addition to being very very big on gender equality, was also a little more gradual, where Garrett Smith's abolitionism was more like immediate. Like, no, we free these people now, kind of like a John Brown style abolitionism. And so he's important in influencing Frederick Douglass to move to that more extreme view. Or more.
I'm sorry, you mentioned John Brown, and I'm thinking, did you ever read that like glowing letter that John Brown wrote after he met Harriet Tubman?
No.
He got to meet Harriet Tubman and he thought she was awesome.
Yeah.
And he like wrote to people about it, but it's just funny. Like he kept talking, and I don't know, he was a product of his time and a little bit of a weird dude, but he just kept talking about how manly she was.
Okay.
Like that was like the highest praise he could give, was that she was like super manly and badass.
Yeah, you see that a lot with like men try to compliment women in history. Like even up to like the 40s and 50s, that was like a common compliment.
She's
for
like,
a woman.
Harriet Tubman, she's like a real man's man.
Yeah, John Brown is awesome. Religious weirdo, but used his religious fanaticism for good. So Smith organized the convention in Casanova in 1850 to express opposition to the fugitive slave law that had been passed earlier that year. That event, it featured 50 fugitive slaves and attracted hundreds of abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass. About 2,000 people attended the convention's second day. So it was a big deal. The convention produced a letter called "To American Slaves from Those Who Have Fled from American Slavery, advocating for the immediate abolition of slavery and condoning the use of violence in efforts for their escape."
All right.
Widely believed that the letter was authored whole or in part by Smith, and many speakers and newspaper editors, even in the North, attacked the convention as being overly radical.
It takes balls to pen like an open letter that has condoning violence in the title.
Yes. They're like, yeah, They're like, well, we think that you should probably kill some people to free people. Yeah. It's one of the only reasons that's okay to like use violence, really.
Yeah. Violence. I'm usually opposed to political violence.
Yeah. But there's like a clear and immediate need here.
Yeah.
Like it's like liberating concentration camps in World War II. Like people are immediately in danger.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the times when it is okay.
Yeah. It's pretty much always okay to use violence to help someone that is immediately in danger.
Yes. And that was Garrett Smith's position. But a lot of newspaper editors, like I said, even in the North, they were like, that's too far. We're not comfortable with that. Newspaper editors have always been a little bit centrist and afraid to take bold stances. At least in prominent newspapers.
Yeah. There's the small radical ones.
Mm-hmm. So Garrett Smith, like I said, he'd run for president a bunch of times, ran for governor of New York once, never won, but did end up winning election to the U.S. House of Representatives on an independent ticket, and serving, I think, one term. It was like this, it was one of those weird, complicated series of events where like nobody really won, and he was like the third party, and like he was like the compromise candidate and got to be there. But he found serving in Congress to be disagreeable, and couldn't get anything done because other legislatures lost interest in his moralistic calls for reform. So he resigned halfway through his term.
When was that?
1854.
Okay. See, it seems like he would have liked it. That's like, I feel like that was like right when like Congress people were like beating the shit out of each other. Yeah.
Yeah, apparently they found him to be annoying, and he wasn't able to get anything done because they didn't like him.
Yeah, I feel like that was an exciting time to be in Congress, as Congress goes. Like people were like pulling knives and punching each other.
Yeah. So he resigned from Congress and decided to focus on philanthropy and private organizing. And as I mentioned, his calls for violence made me think of John Brown. He was a member of what was called the Secret Six, a group of Northerners who funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, West Virginia.
Oh yeah, I've read about the Secret Six.
Yeah, so Garrett Smith was one of the Secret Six.
Yeah, people still aren't sure who all of them are.
Yeah,
yeah.
He was not happy with the raid's outcome and actually suffered a brief nervous breakdown. And it just didn't go the way he wanted it to. And he had a hard time with it. It remained controversial throughout his life how much he knew regarding Brown's plans for an armed slave revolt. So people are like, well, did he have a nervous breakdown because it failed and he was upset that it failed and that John Brown was condemned to death? Or did he have a nervous breakdown because he didn't know that John Brown was going to use violence to that extent? I think it's unlikely that he didn't know that John Brown was going to use violence to that extent.
It seemed like even if he didn't, he was openly condoning violence in that cause.
Yes, that's the thing. He openly condoned violence in that cause. And John Brown had already been killing people. Yes.
John Brown went to Kansas and murdered a ton of people.
Yeah. So I think Garrett Smith knew. I think
Bleeding Kansas was John Brown was all over that.
I could see his guilt and his nervous breakdown over it being that thinking oh, I shouldn't have pushed him to do this. I shouldn't have funded him to do this because John Brown got caught and John Brown was going to be executed and taken off the board essentially as a major abolitionist figure.
Yeah.
I could see feeling bad that you funded somebody to go
to their ends
to go on a failed mission. So I think that's probably more likely the cause of Garrett Smith's
anybody that knew anything
breakdown.
about John Brown wouldn't be surprised that he was gonna start an armed slave revolt.
Right. So after all this, Garrett Smith took a strong interest in women's dress reform.
Okay.
That was a thing that he decided to get into for a while.
In what way?
He sought more practical and healthful clothing for women.
Well, that's a valid cause.
It is a valid cause to the point where his daughter, Elizabeth Smith Miller, is credited with developing the dress reform's signature garment, the bloomer.
Oh, so she invented the bloomer.
His daughter, with his backing, invented the bloomer.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah, so that was him. I mean, that was Garrett Smith, major philanthropist behind the abolition movement, helped fund John Brown.
And one of the Secret Six. That's a big deal. Yeah.
And eventually, and then got into making bloomers for women.
All right.
Help his daughter make bloomers for women. Yeah. Like you said, it's a silly thing now, but
women's clothes were ridiculous.
Yeah. They needed it. They needed the help.
They weren't allowed to wear clothing that was in any way reasonable.
No.
It was a low point in women's clothing.
Yeah. So that's kind of where we're at this point in terms of abolitionism. There's this abolition movement has grown from, the very first writings in the Germantown Quaker meeting in 1688 to full-blown conventions in 1850 and
full-blown conventions that are openly advocating violence.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that coupled with the growth of these personal liberty laws in northern states, making it harder for slavers to, capture their human chattel and bring them back to the South, was major driving forces for both the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 as well as later the Civil War. And I do want to just kind of touch on that again. Like I said, we went over that in our previous background episode. I do want to touch on the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 a little bit more just to summarize. But before we get to that, I also think it's worth pointing out that shit wasn't awesome in the North either.
Yeah.
We're talking about these, societies in Philadelphia and, this convention in New York. And that's all well and good. And it's important, but they were still super fucking racist and it still wasn't awesome. So I just want to look at Pennsylvania real quick as kind of a example for a northern state in general.
Well, you don't have to advocate for the equality of black people if black people are generally agreed upon to be equal.
Yeah. And so I think, and I want to kind of just use Pennsylvania as a stand-in for northern states in general, because it's where our story takes place and it's where we live. And so, as I had mentioned, prior to the Gradual Abolition Act in Pennsylvania, owning a slave in PA was mostly a show of wealth and not to generate more wealth. The cost of a slave was in the pre-revolution Pennsylvania. The cost of a slave was about 45 pounds, which exceeded the estate of 1/3 of PA's taxable residents. So, 1/3 of people in Pennsylvania did not make enough money in a year to buy a slave. So they were quite expensive. 1 in 6 Pennsylvania households were involved in slavery, which is a pretty high number still, 1 in 6. Most only owned 1. So it's they just own like 1 dude just to say they're wealthy.
Yeah.
Which is real shitty.
Yeah.
And weird. The first colonial law in Pennsylvania, which was passed in 1700, did not differentiate between free and slave. Basically in 1700, the colonial Pennsylvania set up different courts to hear all cases involving black people.
Okay.
So that was their first law that looked at race at all, was to say they should have separate courts. Their punishments in these courts were whippings instead of the fines that people would get for similar crimes in the white courts. And they also said that no black person could testify against a white person, like, period. That just couldn't happen. In 1723, Pennsylvania passed a law that separated free and slave. They started looking at them differently. That law placed additional restrictions on the movement of free black people. So they were, at this point, because Pennsylvania was never a state that had a lot of slaves, they were actually more concerned with free black people.
Right.
Enslaved black people, there was only a small number of them, and they weren't allowed to go anywhere. So they were worried about the free black people and the influence the free black people would have on the community. So they passed this law in 1726 to keep free black people from moving freely. The law said that free black people were idle, slothful, burdensome to the neighborhood, and a bad example. They sought to limit the size of the free black population by imposing a 30-pound indemnity on masters who freed their slaves as a bond against them becoming a burden on the community. That law allowed a jurist to return a free man to slavery if he misspent his time.
Okay.
Yeah. In colonial PA, all children...
That seems awfully subjective.
It's very subjective. Yeah, they didn't want free black people just wandering around. That scared them. They didn't like that. Colonial Pennsylvania, all children born to free people and all women freed before 21 and men before 24 had to be bound to service of a white master until they reached those ages. So if you were a free black kid in Pennsylvania, born free, you didn't have to be enslaved until you were 21 or 24, depending on your gender, but you had to be like registered as in the service of a white person.
Okay.
Children of mixed race unions were bound similarly until they turned 31 because of additional fears of race mixing.
Oh, right. Yeah, that makes sense.
They tried to put a harsher penalty on them.
On account of the miscegenation.
Yes. 1730 to 1755, prior to Pennsylvania's emancipation in 1780, 250 slaves from the South fled to southeastern Pennsylvania, and about 53 were caught. So despite the fact that they still had these fairly harsh laws in Pennsylvania, prior to 1780, it was still not uncommon for slaves from Maryland and other southern states to escape into Pennsylvania, because it just didn't have the slave culture that other states had. Like they weren't in any way, shape, or form a fan of black people, and they still had slavery as part of their state, but it just wasn't, you didn't have the big plantations. You didn't have, an economy based on slavery. So it was still common for people to try to flee to southeastern Pennsylvania in the decades leading up to Pennsylvania's gradual abolition of 1780. A free black person imprisoned under suspicion of being an escaped slave in this time period was held while ads were run looking for their master. If none came forward, they were then sold until they worked off the cost of their incarceration.
Oh.
Which is real shitty.
They would arrest you
for being black.
They would hold you for, I guess, some predetermined amount of time.
Yeah.
To give people a chance to answer the ads.
Yep.
Then they would let you out of prison, but they wouldn't let you go.
They would sell you to some farmer.
They would lease you out.
Yes.
To cover the cost of
the time that they imprisoned you.
Yes. For not having done anything wrong.
No, just for being a black person in Pennsylvania.
That's shit like that. Like, I feel like everybody acknowledges that, like, no matter how hard we try, there will be the occasional miscarriage of justice.
Yeah.
But it's like super egregious when, like, the law as it is designed and intended, like, screws people over that didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Like, knowingly. Like, that law as it is written, like, acknowledges that a free black person who, like, if you're arrested for if you didn't commit the crime of being a slave or whatever, like, you're going to get in trouble. Like, there's a stiff legal penalty for you for no reason.
Yes.
Like, that, I don't know.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
It's absolutely horrible. And that's what I said. Like, I wanted to touch on what was going on in Pennsylvania, because I didn't want this to come across as like the northern states were awesome.
Yeah.
And so, like it's better. It's definitely better to have states where slavery isn't a part of the culture and they have these gradual abolition laws and all that. But they still weren't great. It wasn't great
gradual
anywhere.
Abolition is definitely better than perpetual slavery.
Yeah.
But
so beginning in the 1820s, Pennsylvania's southern counties, Chester, Lancaster, York, etc., repeatedly petitioned the state legislature to stop the immigration of black people from the South. They didn't specify how. They just said to stop the immigration of black people from the South. I guess they wanted to build a wall. I don't know. It did not receive support from both houses in the same year. Some years, the state Senate would say that they supported stopping this migration. Some years the state house would say, but they never got on the same page with it. In 1829, state lawmakers did agree to a joint statement between the two houses of the Pennsylvania legislature that said that the removal of black people would be highly auspicious to the best interests of the country.
Isn't it like, I'm not like, I'm no expert on the Constitution, but isn't there something in there about like your right to travel? Like I think so. Don't people have like a legal right to like enter other states?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they do.
But this is one of those like they don't count as citizens. The Constitution doesn't apply rules, right?
Right. They don't.
Right.
They're not sure if they're people or not.
Yeah.
1837, black voters in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, were believed to decide a close election. So the state constitution was amended to limit voting to just white people.
Oh. So they were like, it's okay if black people vote until black people voted.
Yeah, and then until it was like a close race where they thought black people made a difference.
Yeah.
And then they said black people couldn't vote in Pennsylvania anymore. Newspapers in Pennsylvania frequently ran advertisements for escaped slaves. And from the late 1700s to the Civil War, these newspapers typically depicted black people as untrustworthy or dumb. They, would write stories about them stealing or using ultra violence to, harm white people. There was a kind of this interesting change over time where earlier papers, especially like in Lancaster, for example, would portray black people as like foolish, simple, incompetent, cowardly, prone to excessive drinking, that kind of stuff. And then later, as we get closer to the Civil War, they start to, the same newspaper that, in Lancaster County,
they made them more sinister.
They would start to depict them, committing random acts of violence, being highwaymen, battering down doors, setting fires, poisoning people, starting slave insurrections. Like they went from being like portrayed as like simple and silly to being like dangerous and violent over that kind of time period leading up to the Civil War. unsurprisingly, white women were portrayed as the victims more than men in these stories. Over the 69 years that this actually, I forgot to do my sources at the top. I'll touch on that at the end. But this time period of this Lancaster paper that they looked at over the 69-year period, there was a lot of stories about gun accidents committed by black kids accidentally shooting people or accidentally shooting themselves, and none about white kids having accidents with guns.
I'm sure white kids were having accidents with guns.
Yeah, they definitely were. I mean,
and I'm sure and I bet some of those, the accidents weren't accidents.
Well, also, white kids had easier access to guns at the time. Like a lot of states, because a lot of these were stories like from the South. They'd be like, oh, check out this crazy thing that happened in Alabama. A lot of states, especially a lot of southern states, had specific laws against black people owning guns and dogs.
Yeah, guns and dogs.
And so I'm sure more white kids had access to guns and more.
And people have accidents with guns.
Yeah.
It's like a thing about guns. Like it was like, well, at this point, it was like, I think a year ago, but there was like, it was one of those, like, you got to subscribe to like the right newsletters to be notified, but we had like an unauspicious like week last year where it was like the first time in like 20 years we went an entire week in the United States without a child under 5 killing themselves or someone else by accident with a firearm.
Yeah, I remember that. And so that's why it's just crazy. Like the 69-year period that they reviewed this Lancaster County paper, and we have multiple stories of black kids accidentally firing guns and not a single one about a white kid doing the same thing. Also, that same period of time, there was a lot of stories about black people accidentally setting themselves on fire.
Okay.
That was a common theme in that time period that they like to talk about.
I can't imagine that black people are setting themselves on fire all that often.
Well, it's possible. I'm sure it's not all that often, but it does seem likely that slaves experienced more accidents because of their working conditions and sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, anybody that does manual labor is going to experience more, like, if you look at like workplace accident statistics, like accountants aren't getting their arms cut off.
No. And it's also like, and I'm sure, working conditions for like a white laborer at the time weren't awesome either, but like you read these, stories about what it was like under slavery, and these people were not allowed to sleep in a lot of cases. Like you had to be on call 24/7. Like, so yes, like sleep deprivation is also probably a huge factor in workplace accidents.
Definitely.
Like, I've read some stories about like, this time period and slaves, and it just talks about like, the mistress of the house waking up their like chambermaids like every hour to like get them a glass of water or like make them a midnight snack. And it's just, and you read these stories and you're like, yeah, you don't have any fucking time to sleep.
It's like having a newborn baby for your entire life.
Yeah.
That like zombie like phase of like having a newborn when you have to get up with them like every single hour all night. Yeah. Like imagine if that never ended.
Yeah. So I fully believe that
and your baby could have you killed.
Yes. Yeah. So I fully believe that they had more accidents and maybe lit themselves on fire more often. There's a lot of people used to light themselves on fire a lot. That not so much in this time period as when like the gas stove became new.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it, and I know 3 people that have lit themselves on fire like badly enough to do significant damage. All of them white, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sure, but
for the record,
but there was no reason for this newspaper in Lancaster to be reporting on it so intensely.
Yeah. They were trying to come up with black people are dumb stories.
Yeah. There's also a possibility that some of these accidents they reported on were willful acts of destruction.
Yeah.
Like, you can't discount that, and I don't blame them one bit.
Yeah.
If you wanna bust up their, the cooking stove, like
be like, oops, your house burnt down.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I completely understand why people would want to do that. So larger black populations in Pennsylvania and increased economic prosperity led to greater hostility from whites in the North, who were mostly okay with black people remaining unseen or occupying the lowest rung of society. But in some places, there were black communities that were starting to do quite well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was, I didn't actually take notes on here, so I might not get it 100% right. But right in this time period, there was a black community in York, Pennsylvania that was starting to do pretty well economically. And the response from the whites in York was to create this whole crazy arson conspiracy and round up like 35 black people and imprison them on this like entirely made up idea that there was this arson ring running around York lighting things on fire.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of person that still exists, but I think used to be a lot more common, that nothing in the world upsets them than seeing a black person like succeed to like a higher degree than them.
Mm-hmm. And like when we talk about these communities in Pennsylvania and other northern states that were starting to do okay economically, like it's relative.
Yeah.
From 1830 to 1860, over 5,000 African Americans arrived in southern Pennsylvania. Out of that group, about 20% died within 5 years. Like it was not awesome.
Yeah.
Like an economic improvement is an improvement from 20% dying in 5 years.
Yeah.
A 5-year mortality rate. Like it doesn't take much to improve from that. That's a very low bar.
No, that's like the mortality rate of like people with cancer.
Yeah. So yeah, the death
not just regular folks trying to get by.
So yeah, so they're like, oh, they're not dying, 1 out of 5 of them isn't dying every year. Like this we have to be worried about their economic prosperity. The death rate of poor black people was 100 in 1,000, where poor white people, the death rate was 45 in 1,000 per year. So way worse.
Yeah.
Way worse for them. In the 18th century, the black population of Pennsylvania increased due to escaped slaves and more people in freedom. More people gaining their freedom. White identity of power was threatened, especially by the economically successful black people, as I said. And so, the thing is, like, the population increased so much in the 18th century because despite all this, despite the harsh laws and the high death toll and the just rough fucking life these people had in Pennsylvania, it was still better than being a slave.
Yeah.
Like that's the important part, is that like Pennsylvania was not awesome. Northern slave states were not awesome. Nowhere in the country was great to black people. And they still coveted freedom in these northern states. Because people don't want to be enslaved. People will put up with a much shittier life just to be free.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the important part, that like, that's what like Edward Gorsuch didn't get. He didn't understand why his slaves wouldn't come back home, because like clearly they had a more comfortable life on his farm than they must be living in Pennsylvania as freemen. George Washington not understanding why Ona Judge could run away, from her life at Mount Vernon and her life in the
presidential George
mansion.
Washington, like,
yeah,
see, he's George Washington.
Yes.
Like George Washington's life was awesome,
mm-hmm.
and he still thought it was totally worth it to fight a long, bloody war against the most powerful nation on the planet.
Yeah,
like to not have them telling him what to do.
Yes. But these white guys like Washington, like Gorsuch, they just couldn't. They were right. They were right to look at the Society for Free Black People in Pennsylvania and be like, that's shitty. Like, I don't beat them. I'm not the worst slave owner in the world. Why would they want to live in this like, shitty rundown like hovel in Pennsylvania when they could be like living in like a warm cabin on my farm? Like, they weren't wrong to think that the life that these black people were living in Pennsylvania wasn't tough and hard. They were just wrong to think that it was preferable to be enslaved. Right. And it seemed like so many of these guys just couldn't get that through their head. They just couldn't understand that slavery was wrong. And it just blows my mind that, like, we've talked about before, like, I think in the first episode, you talked about how by 1850, you should know better.
Right.
like there's so much evidence by 1850 that slavery is fucking wrong, and there's so many people who changed their mind, but there's still these guys like Edward Gorsuch that can't get it. He can't change his mind. He can't realize that it's wrong.
And it's one of the weird things about American slavery, like, because there have been a lot of countries that to a significant degree like depended on slave labor, like even more so than the United States. But the thing about the United States and slavery is that like I can't think of another country that has the same like inherent contradiction, like, because like America was special because America was like, we weren't like, okay, like this is what America is. America is like, it wasn't like it's these people with these bloodlines. It was like, a nation of like immigrants from, at the time, 4 countries in Europe that counted as like real people, but still, like, it wasn't like a bloodline, like citizenship thing. It wasn't even like the borders of the country were like in flux and changing. It wasn't even like a territory thing. Like, this is the land of my fathers kind of thing. It was like America was a country that was like built on like ideals.
Yeah.
And it was built like specifically on ideals of freedom and self-determination. Like the whole reason that we have a country, like at least like the way it was like built up and like sold to people, was there is a tremendous amount of value to like the human spirit in like you being the master of your own fate,
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know, that's why American slavery is so weird. Because we were like, well, not those people.
Right.
Like it was all these like grand, like high ideals, and like, it was like a third of the population of the country just like wasn't included in that. Yeah, it doesn't count.
So this is like where we're at in 1850. We have there is a Fugitive Slave Act from 1793. It is being challenged by a growing abolition movement. It's being challenged by northern states where, despite their significant issues, are passing these personal liberty laws and gradual abolition acts. And it's causing a lot of tension. The southern states are not happy about that. So they start pushing for some kind of reform to the Fugitive Slave Act, to something to strengthen it. In 1850, Senator Henry Clay was concerned about this tension and thought that it was going to lead to a civil war.
Right.
He was right. He was a member of the Whig Party known as the Great Compromiser because he's the one that worked out the Missouri Compromise. And so he thought he could do it again. He's like, I'm going to come up with another compromise to avert a civil war. He got sick, got too ill to argue his case before the Senate. So his plan was taken up by Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, of Lincoln Douglas debate fame. Douglas was an ardent proponent of states' rights when it came to deciding the issue of slavery. He was a big fan of states being allowed to have slaves if they thought that was a good idea. The full compromise failed to pass, so Douglas split it into an omnibus of bills, or split the omnibus bill into individual bills, which permitted the Congress to vote on them individually. This was the Compromise of 1850. It was made up of 5 separate bills that followed these main points. It permitted slavery in Washington, D.C., but outlawed the slave trade. It added California to the Union as a free state, established Utah and New Mexico as territories that could decide via popular vote whether or not they would have slaves, defined the boundaries of the new state of Texas following the Mexican-American War, removing its claims to parts of New Mexico, but awarding the state $10 million in compensation, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required citizens to assist in the apprehending of runaway slaves and denied enslaved people the right to a trial by jury. Any person found guilty of harboring or supporting an accused fugitive could be imprisoned for up to 6 months and fined $1,000, nearly 100 times the average monthly wage of a Pennsylvania farmer in 1850. This is the law that will be tested in the trial that would follow the Christiana riot.
And It's like something I should know, but I don't. What was the general feeling on slavery amongst the Mormons when they were?
I don't know.
When they became a territory out there.
I don't know.
Because they were like the dominant population. It's like whatever.
Yeah.
Like I imagine if like the Mormon church had like a teaching on slavery when Utah became a territory, that would be their position.
Was it in 1972 God changed his mind about black people?
Yes.
That's the line.
But that was about them being like
being able to be Mormons.
Able to be I think specifically being able to be like clergymen.
Yeah.
Like be like full members of the church.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if what the Mormon thought on slavery was.
Yeah, it's just you were talking about, Utah coming in and them being able to make up their own mind. And it just seems like at that point, like, they were kind of like a monolith. Like there was like, a handful of like weird prospector types and like, Yeah,
Utah, I don't know a
but
whole
like
lot.
the voting bloc in Utah at that point was the Mormon church. Yeah.
Yeah. At some point I'm going to have to do like a deeper dive on like the history of Utah and the like during this time period, because it is like fascinating how it was like this weird Western state that was like more advanced than all the other Western states during the age of exploration out there, because it was run by this weird cult.
Yeah.
Like I could imagine just like crossing the Western United States and like starving and like stumbling across like this like shining city of like on the Salt Lake, and it's run by this weird cult. Like it's something out of like a post-apocalyptic movie.
It is. You're like these people are insane, but like they have unity. Like the trains are running on time. Like everybody's like working towards like common goals.
Yeah. It's I don't know a whole lot about it, and I don't know what their position on slavery was at this time.
But you're right. Like that is like a scene in like any one of those stories.
Yeah.
It's like you're like, oh wow, like this is like a paradise. And then you're like, wait a minute, there's something going on here.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's definitely something I'm gonna have to dig into more later, but I don't know. But yeah, like I said, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 compelled all citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves and denied enslaved people the right to a jury trial. Placed control of individual cases into the hands of federal slave commissioners, where under the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, it was kind of individual local slave catchers and magistrates. Now they are creating this federal slave commission and these federal slave marshals and commissioners who will play a role in the search for the men who escaped from Retreat Farm. It paid more for, I think I mentioned this in the past episode, it paid more for returning a suspected slave than freeing them.
It was like $10 to keep them a slave and $5 to free them.
Yeah, so judges were incentivized to, side with the Southern slavers. From A True Story of the Christiana Riot, Pennsylvania, that's a book. Like I said, I forgot to quote my sources at the top. Pennsylvania furnished more victims furnished more victims than any other state of the Union to this detestable fugitive slave law. Every peaceful valley as well as populous town was infested with prowling kidnappers on the watch for their prey. Quiet homes and peaceful communities were constantly threatened with midnight incursions of manhunters. With these treacherous stratagems their ruffian outrages and bloody violence, and menacing the defenseless people of color with a reign of terror. It was like I said, from The True Story of the Christiana Riot, quoting a white Lancastrian, describing the 12 months of heightened kidnapping from September 1850 to 1851, following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. PA officials could no longer resist the efforts to recover escaped slaves. All these personal liberty laws were essentially void now. But for the most part, the law was tolerated in Pennsylvania. They said that it was enforced quietly and without fanfare. The price of a enslaved person in Maryland jumped 35% following the passage of the law. Basically saying like, oh, now it's less likely they're going to escape, so we're going to increase the price of them, which made the idea of kidnapping free black people in Pennsylvania and bringing them back to Maryland and pretending they're slaves more profitable and more common.
Yeah, it's a self-reinforcing.
Yep.
Yeah.
There was one infamous Philadelphia kidnapper by the name of George Alberti, was indicted twice for selling free people into slavery. Which you shouldn't be able to commit that crime more than once.
No,
one time should be the end.
No, yeah, it's the punishment should be harsh enough that you don't get a second opportunity.
Yeah. He eventually admitted to kidnapping some 100 people over the course of his career.
Damn.
The governor of Pennsylvania would pardon Alberti after he served less than a year of his 10-year sentence for kidnapping an infant.
Jesus.
Yes.
Who even wants a baby slave?
I know.
Like, what can a baby do?
Yeah.
God damn. That's just like evil for the sake of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Dude served less than a year.
And they got pardoned. They were like,
yeah,
no, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. This Fugitive Slave Act tipped the balance of power even more to the side of slave owners and catchers and brought the federal government in on their side. Again, from the book, The True Story of the Christiana Riot. Rebellion or flight was the slaves' only hope for freedom. The government now lets loose its minions upon them, refusing them shelter from the law, gives its law as an engine of cruelty into the hands of the manhunters. What wonder that, outlawed as they are, they think it no crime to defend their liberties by the same means, for using which the revolutionary heroes of our own and other countries are glorified. So we're at a point now where, we've talked about how these people escaped. We've talked about who William Parker is, and they are hiding in William Parker's house. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1750 has emboldened Edward Gorsuch to go get them back and supplied him with a federal slave marshal.
And just to refresh
help
people, if you try to kidnap people and sell them into slavery, William Parker will fuck you up.
Yes, he will. And so next week we're going to start talking about the actual riot itself. So we're finally there.
All right.
Sources for this, because I forgot to do it at the top. Like I said, every main source for the whole series is the book Bloody Dawn by Thomas P. Slaughter. For this particular episode,
I still think that's funny.
Yeah. For this particular episode, we also have the book A True Story of the Christiana Riot by David R. Forbes in 1898. History.com on the Fugitive Slave Acts. WhiteHouseHistory.org. That's from last episode. EssentialCivilWarCurriculum.com, Personal Liberty Laws. RBHayes.org on the Prig versus Pennsylvania. History.com on the Compromise of 1850, a Smithsonian Magazine article entitled "In 1851, a Maryland farmer tried to kidnap free blacks in Pennsylvania. He wasn't expecting the neighborhood to fight back," by James Del Zochello. LincolnConspirator.com, Conspirators.com, Freedom's Battle Christiana, FreeThoughtTrail.org. Historical events, Fugitive Slave Convention at Casanova. And so next week we will discuss the
culmination,
the hunt through Pennsylvania and the riot in Christiana.
All right.
Thank you for listening, and goodbye.